What I'm hoping to try to do today is convince you that humans have become a geological superpower, that we are as powerful as a meteorite impact hitting the Earth or plate tectonics that have moved the continents around. And I think we need to have this because it changes our philosophical view of ourselves and, of course, the world. So what is the Anthropocene? So the Anthropocene is defined as a slice of Earth history during which people have become a major geological force. And one of the actual questions is, when did it begin? And of course, as you know, scientists love to debate, to argue, sometimes to backstab each other, and this is one of those really exciting subjects whereby that debate has really hotted up. So the first thing is, can I convince you, are we really in the Anthropocene? Are we really a geological superpower? So scientists have used what they call planetary boundaries to try and make a way of looking at the world which is not just about climate change. You can see climate change at the top, but as you go round the wheel, you can see that we would look at biosphere integrity, how much land use we're using, freshwater use, biochemical flows, ocean acidification, which is called the evil twin to climate change. We have aerosols, ozone, and the one that I most like, at the top right, is novel entities. We scientists know that there are things that have been generated in labs around the world, and we have no idea when those are released into the world what effect they're going to have. So we leave that one in there as an unknown. So these boundaries, you can see that they're going from green to red. Some of them we feel that we've already passed some of the major boundaries. And I'm just going to sum up 4 of these. Top left, nitrogen. We have completely changed the nitrogen cycle. During the Second World War, the Haber-Bosch process was invented, which allowed us to fix nitrogen into ammonia. Now, admittedly, it was done to make bombs, but of course, ammonia is a key element for fertilizers. If you take the world now and all the atmospheric nitrogen that's been fixed into fertilizers, guess what? Half of it is being done by humans. Okay? The nitrogen cycle has not been this disrupted for about 2.5 billion years. So that's just the nitrogen cycle. If we look at the greenhouse gases, we've increased CO2 by 40% over the last 100 years, and we've doubled the amount of atmospheric methane compared with the last 1,000,000 years. If we look on the bottom left, 30% of all the land in the world is actually used by humans. And you can see the shading there. The shading is where 30% or more of that land is used for cultivation. So think about it. Over nearly 30% of all the land surface is used for humans. And then we have mass extinction. We are now causing the extinction of many, many organisms, whether it's plants, animals, or whether it's actually bacteria. We are actually causing a huge amount of extinction. And I'll give you an example of how we've changed the biosphere. If you take the whole weight of all the mammals on land, 30% of all the mammals on land are humans. 67% of all the mammals on land are our livestock and our pets. Which means when we watch those wonderful programs with African elephants and we look at the wild coyote and things like that, that only makes up 3% of the weight of mammals left on the land. So, I believe, and many scientists do, that we have moved into a new era where the planet is completely dominated by humans. Now this is beauty, okay? This is 200 to 300 years of scientific endeavor. It is the geological time scale. It defines the whole of Earth history from 4.5 billion years ago, and it is split up into different periods. You may recognize them: the Jurassic, the Cretaceous, the Triassic. You can see those big blocks of time. And those blocks of time are split up by periods of revolution where things have really changed. The one that many of us know, which is at the top of the Mesozoic there, at the top of the Cretaceous, is 66 million years ago. A meteorite hit Mexico and killed off the dinosaurs. Okay, killed off non-avian dinosaurs, because as my children keep worrying about, birds are the ancestors of dinosaurs, which is rather worrying when you look at a chicken and think, God, you used to be a dinosaur. Okay, really doesn't actually add to the glory of dinosaurs. But that was a major revolution, a change in biology, and these periods are all defined by these boundaries. So we have a look at the most recent period of time. You can see we've got into the wishy-washy colors because we're near the current period. We're in the Cenozoic era. We're in the Quaternary period, defined by the great ice ages that started 2.5 million years ago. And right at the top, we're in the Holocene epoch, which started about 11,000 years ago. And this is the current interglacial, the warm period that we're in. So we look at the last 20,000 years. We start off on the left-hand side. We have an ice age with very cold temperatures, with ice sheets 3 kilometers thick sitting over Chicago. Okay? Huge Laurentide ice sheet on North America. We then have this dramatic warming that occurs through from 15,000 years and ends about 11,000 years ago. And then we have this relatively stable and warm period in which humans have flourished. And that's the current definition of this epoch or geological period. So I'm going to question that and say, well, hang on. Are things as we expect? So I'm going to traipse through almost all of human history. I'm going to look at our environmental impacts. I'm also going to look at the society and the actual politics of the period of time. So we started with early agriculture and the age of empire. At the last interglacial, so the last deglaciation, when the ice retreated, suddenly around the world in 4 different places, agriculture started. Domestication of crops and livestock occurred independently, both in Africa, the Middle East, over in China, and in the Americas. Now, this was a huge revolution because it meant that the hunter-gatherers could then actually stay in one location, producing food and becoming settled. Massive revolution. But Bill Rudiman, a professor at Columbia University and then Virginia, he noticed something interesting about the climate records. So if we look at the ice core records, so these are bubbles that are trapped in the ice cores that are drilled in Antarctica and Greenland, you can go back through history and look at the changes in the greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide and methane. And you see that for most periods of time, and that's the blue line, you start with a warm period, and then slowly the methane and the CO2 drop, and then you go into the next ice age. Okay? About 10,000 years, and then we go into the next ice age. And what he noticed was, and if you look at the red, our current Holocene period does something very odd. So you see that here with methane, it goes down, down as you expect, and then suddenly about 5,000 years, it kicks up again. It's very odd. CO2 goes down, down, and then suddenly about 6,000 years, kicks up. Now, what's really amazing is that we think this is because of early agriculture and farming. We think that the CO2 rise is because of deforestation. We think that the methane rise is because of the spread of wet rice agriculture, particularly in China. Now, these changes, as you can see, look big. That's because, of course, we've put them in a nice big graph. They're not that big, but they have shifted the world away from this downward trend, and a couple of my colleagues argue that the changes in those greenhouse gases may have prevented us from tipping into the next ice age in the next 1,000 years or so. So, is this the beginning of the Anthropocene? Can we blame it on the early farmers? Have we changed the world? Was that the key thing? But But if you look, say, at the Roman Empire at its height, conquered most of Europe, one key thing is that didn't really have a big environmental impact, okay? Didn't have any global significance. So it's just that farming. And when we put this on a scale, so down the bottom we have 10,000 years to the future, and we show here sort of the livestock and where it's spread. You can see spread of agriculture through the world, deforestation, soil erosion, atmospheric, CO2, and methane. The little wedge for each one of those shows what those early agriculturalists had done, whereas the big block on the right-hand side shows what we've done in the last 100 years. So the interesting thing is that the early agriculturalists did change greenhouse gases by a small amount. However, nothing else really changed, and it could have been reversed. So perhaps that's not the definition of the Anthropocene. So what's stage 2? Globalization of humanity, and I love this, the dawn of capitalism. Okay? If you want to blame anybody, it's probably good to blame Christopher Columbus and the rediscovery of the Americas. Okay, I put that in strong terms in 1492. This led to an amazing exchange between the continents. So the collision of the old world and the new world caused the Columbian Exchange. So we took from the Americas maize, potatoes, sweet potatoes, beans, peanuts, squash, pumpkins, and all the rest on that list. What's interesting, if you go into Africa now, the staple diet is maize and cassava. They're not African, they're from South America. If you then look at what we imported, or we took to there, wheat, sugar, bananas, rice, grapes, dandelions, horses, pigs, cattle, goats, sheep, chickens, smallpox, measles, typhus. Okay? And I'm going to come back to that because that's really important. This global exchange continues to this day. One of the things that most people are worried about, and particularly environmental agencies, is invasive species from different places. We have spent the last 400 years exchanging goods between different peoples, trading, but moving plants and animals inadvertently around the world. And this map isn't a map. All it is, and this is, Ben's done this, it's the 18th and 19th century shipping logs. So all it is where the ships went. And as you can see, it beautifully makes the actual maps underneath. And so this is the amount of trade that's going on. And this, interestingly enough, I think is one of the most important things, which is a permanent feature of Earth. I'll give you an example. If you come to North America, and you dig up some soil, the majority of earthworms you will find are European. The reason being is, unfortunately, the Native American earthworms, not that good. What they do is they just eat the soil, and then they do it all fine. Europeans have a little trick, which is they go, oh, food up there. So what they do is they actually go up onto the surface and actually take the leaf litter and pull it down. Can you imagine if we wanted to reverse that? We then say, okay, right, we're going to get rid of all the European earthworms from North America. Can you imagine trying to do that? Okay? So what we've done by moving the biology around has changed the the evolutionary trajectory of the Earth. It also has a beautiful marker for this. So if we have a look at this, this is the number of people in South America from 1300 to 1900. And right in the middle here is a very sad stat. Because we brought smallpox, measles, typhus to the Americas, these people have been isolated from the European and Asians for 13,000 years. They had no natural immunity. We think there was about 60 million people living in the whole of the Americas. About 50 million of them died within about a 50-year period. This is so horrendous that we know that the actual change occurred in the atmosphere. So all those people have been farming in South America, they've been cutting down rainforests to actually make, in the savannah, to actually farm, to feed these 50 million people. As soon as they disappeared, that all grew back and took CO2 out of the atmosphere. So one of the only times in the last 1,000 years there is an actual drop in atmospheric CO2 because of the regrowth of that vegetation. And it's interesting because if you read some of the conquistadors and their reports as they were invading the Americas, the spread of the disease was faster than they could actually travel. They would turn up to cities and find them completely devastated with absolutely no one alive. So, perhaps the Anthropocene should start in 1610. So this is the temperature record for the last 1,000 years, and you can see the temperatures starting to go up at the end because of climate change. But you can see the CO2 drops for the only time in 1610 because of that regrowth, and then slowly bounces back as, of course, people changed. But this change, this annexation of the Americas, changed everything. It changed our thinking. So, for example, we have, of course, Copernicus, who in 1510 suggested that perhaps the Earth wasn't the center of the universe, it was the sun, center of the solar system, and that changed our way of thinking. It's also the burgeoning of capitalism. There's a wonderful quote. So Descartes basically was looking around, and what he said is, "I'm in a great city where I'm living, with no man apart from myself not being involved in trade. Everyone is so intent on his profits that I could spend my whole life without being seen by anyone." Okay? I mean, this is in the 17th century, okay? Not a lot's changed, as far as I can tell. Okay. So the Industrial Revolution is the next stage, 3, from the 1800s. And this is when, of course, we move to a fossil fuel-based economy using coal. And the interesting thing is it occurred in Britain first. And one of the reasons we moved to coal, because we ran out of trees. Okay, so the trees, a lot of them have been cut down for the ships to actually make sure the French didn't take over the world, and for us to actually dominate the seas. And so therefore there was a need for fuel. We'd run out of trees, so we moved to coal. And you can see that the Industrial Revolution spread from the Midlands in the United Kingdom across through the Ruhr, Saxony, and through into Eastern Europe. And actually it took from the 1840s through to the 1870s and 1890s to actually spread out. The Industrial Revolution is still spreading out across the world. There are still areas that haven't gone under the Industrial Revolution. One of the key arguments that I am going to put forward is the Industrial Revolution was not inevitable. If you think about previous civilization, the Egyptians, they had a fantastic civilization for 3,000 years. No Industrial Revolution. The Chinese Empire, absolutely fantastic, well organized, lasted 4,000 to 5,000 years. The Ottoman Empire, fantastic, lasted 1,000 years. None of them had an Industrial Revolution. And what people are now thinking about is, why did Europe have an Industrial Revolution? And if you go back to the 10th century and you look at the history books, Europe was a cesspit. Okay, let's be serious. I mean, you have the Chinese Empire, which is all wonderfully organized. It has grain stores. It looks after people. You then also have the Ottomans, who are then looking after. You then have Europe. Lots of small kingdoms constantly fighting. So the two things that we now believe happened in Europe to create this revolution was, firstly, we had small kingdoms which are about the same size continually fighting. If you look at European history over the last 500 to 1,000 years, we've been constantly at war. There are certain countries, if you look at it, have been at war with another European country for at least 50% of the time. Okay? That's a long time to be at war. But it means that you're constantly involving the technology. And then, of course, what happened is we took over the Americas. So up to that point, civilization is trapped because you have to have loads of people working in the fields to make enough food to keep everybody fed. Okay? So you can only have a few free people and a few rich people that basically don't do anything. Most people are basically producing food. However, if you depopulate inadvertently a whole continent and you take their resources, you take their food, you take their silver and their gold, then it allows you to grow a population beyond your agricultural means. And that's what happened. And so the interesting thing is actually the invasion of South America and the Americas and the death of 50 million people may have inadvertently led to the Industrial Revolution and our industrial lifestyle now. The Industrial Revolution also led, and this is the argument here, to a massive growth in population. So you can see here from 1820s, this is the percentage growth in population through to the 2000s, and as you can see in the 1870s and 1880s, suddenly there's a jump up from stable population where zero is about replacement, and then you start to grow. And you can see there's a few crashes, world wars, pandemics, etc. And then, of course, there's the 1960s, where the population of the planet grew by over 2%. And I'll come on to that next. But the Industrial Revolution also came with a change of thinking. Instead of it being about serfs and people on the land and those who control trade, it suddenly came about workers and the people manufacturing and producing goods. And therefore, we had the emergence of the working class and the struggle of, say, Marxism. And so we then build up a different view, perhaps everybody is actually equal, and therefore perhaps they should have access to all the wealth that's been generated by capitalism. So stage 4 is, for me, the Great Acceleration. That happens post-Second World War, and then the birth of neoliberalism. Everything changed after the Second World War. And the Bretton Woods Conference was probably the most important thing that happened after the war. It is where the Allies sat down and redesigned the modern world. Now, this wasn't something that they sat down and go, guys, let's come up with some ideas, let's brainstorm. They had spent the whole of the last 10 years planning for the peace, okay? Which doesn't normally happen after wars, but they had seen the League of Nations hadn't worked. It was a brilliant idea, but it failed. Therefore, they needed something new. So at this monetary conference, the United Nations was set up. The International Monetary Fund was set up, the World Bank was set up, and the dollar was actually taken as the international currency. This will make you laugh. It was set at the gold standard of $35 an ounce, okay? Yeah, it's gone up a bit since then. So this was the setting of the modern world. And oh, did the world change. So if we look at, say, energy, from 1950s onwards, massive increase in energy consumption, particularly fossil fuels. We also have the first nuclear weapon, which was tested in 1945. And this changed the politics of the world, but it also gives us another spike that we could consider as the start of the Anthropocene. So the red line in there, I apologize, I think it's got a bit faded, but you can see there's a big spike there. That is the radiation, or the radiocarbon, generated by nuclear weapons testing. So from 1945 up until 1963, countries around the world were happily testing their nuclear bombs above ground. Okay? In 1963, pushed by scientists, politicians realized that this was probably not a good idea. And the Partial Test Bomb Treaty came into effect. Fantastic. So as you can see, We have an increase in radiocarbon in the atmosphere up until 1963. And then in 64, it then starts to drop off and has up to today. By the way, that does not mean the countries have stopped testing nuclear weapons. They now do it underground, okay? And you can actually record those with seismic shakes when they actually go off. So they haven't stopped doing it. It's just not actually above ground and causing problems. So this is also work by Will Seffen, and he basically wanted to look at this great acceleration. So he looked at the atmosphere, ocean, terrestrial, social, and economic. And as you can see, not all of them seem to correlate with the 1950s, but there is this huge surge post-1950 in all of these records. We have doubled the number of people since 1950. We went from 3.5 billion to 7 billion. So that's an extra 35 billion people that actually have arrived in the world. Again, because of the revolution in medicines, mainly vaccination, but again, sanitation and healthcare blossomed in the 1950s, driven by American universities like Johns Hopkins. We then have a distribution, so you can see here, this is where the population is currently. You can see, of course, China and India seem to be very large, but again, you can see the United States is quite large, and look at the UK and European countries, again, very large populations. In Africa, interestingly, the population is dominated by Nigeria and Ethiopia. And I put this up for light pollution, because lights, or nighttime lights, is a symbol of how much energy you have, how developed you are. And for me, what's interesting is the population here and the lights don't necessarily correlate. So it means there is a difference between how many people you have and how much money they have. And I've just done that through nighttime lights. Okay? So we then have capitalism blossoming in the 1950s. We have world trade. We have opening up of trade routes. We have the World Trade Organization. And then in the 1980s, we have the emergence of neoliberalism. And I love this cartoon, which basically says, and to the poor people of the world we say, remember, we are counting on you to keep us rich. A year ago, the International Monetary Fund actually said that they think that the last generation of economic policies may have been a complete failure. We've seen with the economic crash in 2008 that completely unregulated commerce doesn't always do it in the fair, trustworthy way. And perhaps we need a little bit more regulation and a little bit more protection for the normal person. This is a study that showed that what happens if you open up a country, a developing country, to foreign flows of capital, you actually make the possibility of a financial crash much more likely, and you also make the inequality in the country bigger. So the idea by neoliberalism that, oh, we all trade, it all be equal, we're all fair, etc., actually, for poor countries, if you open up their actual economy, unfortunately, it has a negative effect. And what is the true state of the world? So if we have a look at the state of the world, 7 million children die needlessly every year. 700 million people go to bed feeling hungry every night, and still 1 billion people do not have access to clean, safe drinking water. Things that we take for granted. Now that 1 billion is 1 in 7 people on the planet don't have clean water. Well, maybe that's because there isn't enough money in the world. Perhaps, poor people are inevitable. Well, perhaps not. This is, again, a symptom of neoliberalism, and I'll show you here. In 2014, the richest 1% of adults owned 48% of the wealth of the planet. A year later, it had grown to 50%. And if we look at the billionaires and the bottom half of the population. So this numbers here is the wealth of billionaires compared with the bottom 3.5 billion people. So in 2010, you had to add 388 of the richest billionaires in the world together to get the same wealth as the bottom 3.5 billion people. By 2015, you only need 62 of them. 62 people, okay, the same number of people that's in this auditorium, okay, own the same as 3.5 billion people. This is the result of neoliberalism and the perversion of capitalism that seemed to be working quite well up to then. So, what are the potential geographies of the future? How can we look at the future, and is there a way of actually improving it? So all current trends lead to what I call the perfect storm, which was a wonderful terminology coined by John Bebbington, who was one of the chief science advisors to the UK government. And what he pointed out was, well, if we look at all the trends, by 2030, so that's only 14 years' time, energy demand in the world will increase by 50%. Food demand will also increase by 50%. Water demand to feed the energy and the food will increase by 30%. We then have development, because of course everybody wants to have the same lifestyle as the middle class in America and Europe. And again, the question is, morally, why shouldn't they? And then we have on the right-hand side population growth, because of course population is still growing, it's slowing, but it's still growing, and there will be extra people, and I'll talk about that later. And then right in the middle we have climate change, which is then causing an additional stress. I talked about this yesterday in my previous talk, but I thought it was important to put it into the context. So if we look at future climate change, these are the computer models that have been generated, and here there are two future stories. The red one is business as usual, i.e. we carry on doing what we're doing now, and we don't regulate fossil fuel emissions. And then the blue one is actually Paris worked, the world suddenly loves each other, and we do everything, and I mean everything we can, to try and reduce our fossil fuel emissions, and therefore keep the temperatures to 2 degrees. It is a challenge. The Paris was an amazing conference. 193 countries actually agreed to do something about climate change. The leadership by President Obama and by the Europeans, and particularly the French, was instrumental in getting that international agreement. But if we look, these are the different amounts of carbon we can emit. So if we look at the top curve, the RCP 8.5, that's the business as usual. We're basically predicting we're just going to carry on doing what we're doing. And then the 2.6 one here, which goes up and down, that one is the way scientists suggest we can get to a 2-degree world and not get warmer. However, yes, slight problem. It means that by 2020, in 4 years' time, we have to start cutting global emissions. We then have to cut global emissions 3% every single year if we're going to try and keep the planet. Now, at the moment, we've not been able to cut global emissions at all. And the last thing that scientists don't usually tell you is that by 2070, even if we've done all this, we will need negative emissions, i.e. we're going to have to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere somehow to try and actually keep to that 2 degree. So the challenges are there. We can do it, don't be under any illusions, but it does take a completely different mindset. Right, is this because we're going to have too many people? Is this what's causing all this global warming? And I have to say, I do love this. I do turn around to my students and say, I'm not sure what worries me more, the 1960s dress, which unfortunately I think is having a comeback, or the actual slogan. So again, population for some reason, like climate change, creates a hysteria, even though we know that the population of the world, this is the UN estimate, we know is actually going to tail off to about 9.5 to 10 billion by the middle of the century, and then will slowly tail off. most interesting thing that I can tell you about this curve is the key to this curve and actually making it turn down quicker is women's education up to secondary school level. Men think they control fertility, they think that they control when they have babies. I'm sorry guys, I hate to tell you it's not true. Women, if they're educated and understand, they will then control when they have children and how many, okay? It's an illusion that we have any control. So, is this our future? Are we looking at 10 billion people by the middle of the century? Are we looking at rapid development? Are we looking at temperature rises of over 4 degrees? Possibly, but not necessarily. Will our future be a healthier one? So if you look at all the trends from the 1950s to the present day, everywhere is getting healthier. Okay? So this is life expectancy at birth, and you can see that in 2010, somebody born in America or Europe will have an expectation of living to at least 80. Okay? Now, of course, if you happen to be African and born today, your expectation is only 55. So the trends are all in the right direction, but there's a huge inequality between countries. There's also huge inequalities within countries. Within my own country, the United Kingdom, if you look at the poorest area of, say, Liverpool, compared with the richest area of London, the life expectancy in London is 15 years longer than in the poor part of Liverpool. So even with developed countries with lots of resources and money, that inequality that's grown up, that we've seemed to have accepted, unfortunately, means that there are huge differences in health and outcomes for people. So are we getting richer? Okay, so we know that the wealth of each country is growing and growing. Well, it depends which country you live in and which percentage you're in. So this is the 1%ers, okay? And as you can see, everything was going fantastically. So on the left-hand side, we have the USA, UK, Canada, Ireland, and Australia. And you can see right into the end of the 1970s, 1979 is the key moment. We're getting more and more equal. So the richest 1% in the US in 1979 had about 9% of all the wealth of the country. Since the 80s and neoliberalism, that 1%, they now have declared, and I'll come back to this, 18% of the wealth. So the richest 1% have actually grown in wealth. They've actually doubled the amount of actual percentage wealth that they have for the country. The bottom 10% haven't changed. They're as poor or not poorer than they were in the 1970s. And this is true of all those countries, UK, Canada, Ireland, and Australia. But it's not written in stone that this must happen. If you look at other countries, and this is the right-hand side to give you some hope, we have countries such as Germany, you know, that fantastic economy. We have Japan, the second largest economy in the world. And guess what? Their 1%ers, their leaders of industry, have kept at a stable percentage of the wealth of the country. Germany is the highest, about sort of 10%, but you can see all the other countries have stabilized. So even in the Western world, there are two completely different models of how you redistribute wealth around the country. So just because certain countries that we actually live in have that, doesn't necessarily mean we have to have it. So this is the UK in terms of property wealth. Okay? And as you can see, the top 1% have blown above 15%. But this is the declared wealth. With the Panama Papers that were released last year, and remember, they're only the 4th largest company in the world to do tax evasion, and this is tax evasion, we now know that the 1%ers are hiding money away, left, right, and center, okay? It's being put into these accounts, and we are not getting those taxes back into our countries. So when we look at these 1%ers and we say, oh, look, okay, yeah, 18% is a bit high. Actually, it's going to be a lot higher if we could just find out how much they're hiding away. And the thing is, have we become tolerant of this inequality? Again, the US is one of the most unequal countries in the Western world. But look at world GDP. It's an upward trend. It's a straight line going up, the amount of money. Just to make you feel good about the USA, the GDP of the United States this year is predicted to be $18.5 trillion. Okay? That's $57,000 per person. That's generated every single year. So why are there poor people? Again, a very interesting question. So again, we've come through this lens of the Anthropocene. We've seen the changes. What about the future? Do we have to go with the rhetoric of neoliberalism, or can we actually go back to normal capitalism and actually perhaps have some progressive and inclusive capitalism, i.e. that everybody is looked after by a capitalist system, not just the 1%ers? And this is what we're now thinking about in the idea of progressive capitalism, is that you have the triple bottom line. Of course, you look after your economy. You make sure that companies are healthy, they grow, etc. But you also ensure that the environment in which we live and is costed properly into the economy. And you also then look after the social. Because I think some of us have forgotten that government is there to look after the people. All the people, not just the ones that can lobby and pay the most. So perhaps, and this might be radical, perhaps we should return to the social democracy. If you look at some of the actual state laws and some of the federal laws that were put through in the 1970s in the United States, they were so progressive, so liberal, a very interesting model. Social democracy. Progressive taxation. And I'm going to throw out this, just because I think this is a brilliant new idea, called the universal basic income. This has been actually suggested by both the, left wing and the right wing, okay? So it's not partisan. Very interesting. So both extremes seem to like this. So the universal basic income says anybody who hits the age of 18 in a country gets a set amount of money per year, okay? And they can decide what to do with it. So it could be $10,000. You could set it at $15,000. And you say, right, every person who's an adult gets $15,000. You then don't have to pay welfare, so you get rid of the welfare bill. You then don't have to worry about them taking out loans or going to university, because they will have that money and they can decide what to do with it. Now, they could decide to sit at home and actually have a really poor life and not do anything and just live off that money. That's fine. Most people, however, will then decide, actually, no, that's fine. I'm actually going to use that money to actually improve myself, get better education, and actually get a job and build up better wealth. But it means that you can remove huge amounts of areas of welfare, and you don't then have to test people to see whether they are worthy of money or not. And I think we'll probably have quite an interesting conversation about that after I finish the talk. So, you have to think radically. So why do the Anthropocene, and some people, particularly the French, have now called it the Capitalism, because they're worried that it's all about capitalization. So, why does defining the human geological time matter? Why are we having this time war when people are arguing about when it is? It comes back to philosophy, and it comes back to science. So I have to say, for the last 500 years, us scientists have told you repeatedly how insignificant you are. Okay? Started off with Copernicus. We all thought that we were doing fine, okay? We were the center of the universe. Copernicus comes along and goes, yeah, no, actually the sun is the center of the universe. You then have cosmologists now saying, well, yes, now, actually, we're just one small sun out of tens and tens of trillions of stars, and our sun's not really that big and not very special, okay? Oh, makes us feel really small. Then the biologists come along, and the biologists go, yeah, you know that sort of it's man, angels, God. Yeah, actually, that's not true. Actually, we've evolved from basically chimpanzees. We're just part of the natural system. We've just evolved. So we're not special. However, consider this. If we are in the Anthropocene, if humans are a geological superpower, it means that we, as a species, control the environmental destiny of this planet and the evolutionary destiny of the planet. And remember, this is the only planet where life exists, and actually now, humanity is in control. And people would argue perhaps we're the stewards that have to actually take that responsibility seriously. So people have started to talk about good versus bad Anthropocene. How are we actually going to do the future? So on the left side, there's this wonderful artist impression of beautiful green cities. We've stopped climate change. And then on the right, I have to explain to younger viewers, which is a beautiful scene from the 1960s Planet of the Apes movie, where Charlton Heston comes along. He's an astronaut. He thinks he's gone to another planet. It turns out actually he's gone to the future. And the last scene is when he realizes that chimpanzees and gorillas have taken over Earth because we blew it up, and there's the Statue of Liberty, and that's his final moment. So I will leave you that the future is not written in stone. Just like after the Second World War, we decided to change the global governance system for the better of all people to try to improve things. It is now, at the beginning of the 21st century, we have to decide, hang on, we have environmental problems, we have social problems, we have global security problems, we have environmental degradation. How do we work as a global society to really improve all of those and try to build some win-win solutions? Thank you very much for listening. And I'm very happy to take questions. Steve, do you have a microphone, or do you want them to shout out? Who wants to go first? Oh.
Good morning. Thank you for that amazing presentation. This is just a little off. Well, it's part of the climate change. Seeding the clouds, chemtrails, how does that affect, or does that play into this? And as far as changing the environment, global warming?
Okay.
Yeah.
So the question is, a lot of countries are now trying to do weather modification, so seeding clouds. The problem there is that if you cause rainfall in one area, then another area doesn't get rainfall. So what we have is this dilemma about how much do we interfere with international borders. So in very large countries, that's less of a problem. So there is I'd say, a international problem and negotiations that go on about trying to modify weather. Chemtrails, they again have a very small effect. Actually, one of the big problems that we have with climate change is that clouds, depends if they're high or low, actually increase or decrease warming locally. And so if you have large white clouds, they reflect a lot of sunlight, that's fine. If you have low clouds, then they actually keep the heat in. So again, chemtrails do contribute a little bit, but they're not massive compared with the actual greenhouse gases.
Can I ask one more quick question?
Yeah, of course you can.
Okay.
We've got half an hour, don't worry, I'm not going anywhere.
Okay. So solar panels.
Yes.
So let's say all of a sudden the whole world goes on solar.
Yep.
How, like the sun is a battery, so now it looks great. Everybody should go to solar. We get rid of fossil fuels. How would that impact the atmosphere? Because the sun is like a battery, so all of a sudden we're sucking all the life out of the sun battery. So in long-term prospects.
Right, so the nice thing about the sun is that it will be producing light for the next 5 billion years, okay? After that, it gets a bit sort of like angry and starts to expand, by that time I'm hoping that humans, if we're still around, will have left the planet. Okay, so the solar output is absolutely fine. It won't be affected. Now, for us, what happens most of the time is a lot of that energy is absorbed by plants anyway. So again, all we're doing is we're taking solar energy that would be reflected out in space or lost anyway, and then just converting it to electricity. So there's absolutely no problem about doing that. One of the things I will say about solar is absolutely fantastic, and in places like Florida, I think that every building should be covered with them. Again, I found out yesterday that I think you spend about $100 million per week on fossil fuels in Florida, whereas Texas, exporting fossil fuels to the other states, actually makes $300 million per week. So yeah, I'm not happy with that. If I was living in Florida, I'd be going, yeah, I'm not having that. I'm not giving money to Texas. I'm going to put loads of solar panels up. So it's interesting how people perceive these things. Again, solar panels work great. They do work in the UK, even though we have a lot of cloud. But you do need what's called baseload. So you still need some way of generating 20% of your electricity that you can rely on to switch on at any time. Okay? And the problem is wind, wave, and wave can give you baseload, and solar is that they are fluctuating. The reason being is, I'll give you an example. You're watching the big football game, okay? And it's getting really tense. And then they call halftime. So everybody goes to the kitchen, they switch on the the kettle for a cup of tea, they open, and you get these huge spikes. Same with big TV shows. You find that Strictly Come Dancing and things like that, there is a peak right at the end of electricity. And the power stations need to be able to crank that up to actually cope with that baseload. So renewables are fantastic, but there is an energy mix that has to be thought about to make sure you still get power when you need it. Oh.
I wasn't going to say anything.
Oh, sorry.
I just want to compliment you on your background. I was thinking when we first started, so young.
No. Lots of makeup. No, lots of makeup and hair gel. No, so, I'm not as young, but thank you.
When you first presented, I said, oh my goodness.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go way happy. I'm coming back here. Question at the back, madam.
Hello, thank you. Thank you. At the very end, you mentioned this distribution of wealth.
Yes.
Could you explain what that theory is called? When did it begin, and who proposes it?
Do you mean the universal basic income?
Yes.
There isn't, we can't trace it back to one particular person. There is a number of economic thinkers over the last 20 years who've been starting to think about it, and there's some good books out there which I can, if you email me, I can send you. The problem is that some of them have the rhetoric of the left, so that's problematic, and some of them have the rhetoric of the right. But at the base of this, it says, well, hang on, if you happen to be born into a country, do you not have the right to their protection? Do you not have the right as a citizen to have schooling? So why do you not have access to the money that the country is generating? Now, it doesn't have to be very much. As I said, you can look at what is the bare minimum people can live on and actually then say, and if you think about it, if it's just $10,000, okay, per year, okay, if you have two people living together, that's $20,000. Now, I would not be happy living on that, okay? But there are lots of people in the United States that are living on a lot less. You get rid of the homeless problem because each homeless person, as long as they're registered and they are legal, they get $10,000. Remember, you generate $57,000 every year per person. And that's without the wealth of the country that's already here. So again, why isn't that a problem? Also, if you want to do things like, well, hang on, we would like people to have perhaps 2 children. So you might then say, hey, okay, if you have 1 child, you get $5,000 extra a year. If you have 2 children, you get $10,000 extra a year. If you have 3, we don't pay you for the extra children. That's up to you, and you can go down that route. That's fine. You can choose that. So you can use it to gently socially support people. But again, Slightly different. Again, in Europe, we have huge welfare bills, okay? We spend a huge amount of our wealth supporting people, but also judging them. So we have the whole middle class is basically going, I'm sorry, how much do you earn? And judging people and saying, well, you can get this benefit, you can't get benefit. You can get rid of all of that by just saying, here's your check. I don't care if you happen to be Donald Trump. I don't care if you're a homeless person. Here's your check, okay? You are an American citizen. You are worthy of having some of the money that we have generated. Now, of course, what I'm hoping is that people will then say, right, 10,000. I'm going to spend that on American goods. Again, suddenly you have the rest of the population spending money. I'm sorry, the billionaires are not spending that money on your economy. They're usually hiding it in Panama, okay, and places like that. So again, you suddenly generate this huge wealth that's being spent in the country. Because I'm sorry, poor people with $10,000 don't go, I'm going to Disneyland and spend. No, they're going to spend it on day-to-day products that they need to live. So it suddenly shifts all of that. Now, of course, economists get really worried, like, oh, if lots of people spend money, then we'll have inflation. Well, no, because what you do is you then make sure the tax laws ease the amount of revenue that's actually flowing. So you make sure that the next $10,000 you earn, you go, hey, you got $10,000 and then you go out to work for another $10,000, I'm not going to tax you. Okay? I'm not going to tax you on your first $10,000 because, do you know what? Good for you. I want you to be working. Then after that, you can then start to slowly increase the taxation. So when you get to people who are very wealthy, then you tax them appropriately. And you say, look, you're using our people, our roads, our infrastructure, our language. I'm sorry. Give us some back so we can actually make sure that everybody, and you then have really good people, highly educated people to work in your factories. So that's the idea. I know, it's a fantastic idea, never going to happen. But, you know, but we would say that. We would say that about, say, the United Nations, but it did work after the Second World War. Sir?
Yeah, I'm wondering what the theory is that the right will support this concept of income equality when they've been so organized in opposition to it over the past 40 or 30 years.
So, different right in different countries, okay? So the obsession in European countries, the right wing, is they cannot stand welfare. Okay? They do not understand why they're giving money to people because they're not working and things like that. They want to try and reduce that bill. Okay? So this actually is a way of saying, hang on, we don't even have to worry about that. I don't have to see how poor and how many children you have and whether I have to buy you a house or whatever. Here, you just take the check and it's simple. Okay? It's a nice, simple, and it's equal. Okay? So the right wing, I know. However, in the US, again, it's about the economy. And I would argue, I want the people to have money to generate the economy. But yes. They don't like welfare either. No. So again, you can get rid of the whole welfare. I mean, I have to say, one of the things that is much easier in my country is, of course, you don't have the problem of Medicare, okay? Yeah, because, again, it doesn't matter how poor you are in the UK, all the medicine is free, okay? So medical health care. And the interesting thing is that we only spend 10% of our GDP on health, okay? And our GDP per person is not as high as the US. You spend 17% of your GDP on health care, and it doesn't cover everybody. So again, it's this thing about, I get frustrated sometimes with the right wing because I understand where they're coming from. And I'm going, but you want an efficient system. You want business to do well. Why are you spending 17% of your money on healthcare when you can build a better system that everybody can have access to for only 10%? Why? Again, and it's then, yes, please come back.
Because that 1% likes the system that it has.
Absolutely.
And it thrives on it. And that's why we can't change that system.
But you live in a democracy. So I'm looking forward to the new American Revolution then. This is fantastic, right? Generated here in Orlando by a Brit who then promptly got on a plane and left and went, it wasn't me. And don't talk to me about tea, that was Boston, okay? Question, sir.
You made a statement. It's not going to happen. My explanation is to transport that statement to climate change, and that we're not going to implement things that will reduce greenhouse gas and so forth, and the temperature will rise. I'm wondering what effect that's going to have on world population, because you showed a chart there of going up 7 to 10 billion,
yep,
and then declining, and you were giving one reason at the education of women. I'm just wondering what the effect of not doing anything about climate change is going to have on world population and our quality of life.
So those are two very interesting questions. The first one is, what effect will climate change have on the population? Absolutely none. So what we've seen is that the rate of change of population can go up and down. Flu epidemics, wars, etc. And that may shift from, say, 0.5% to 1%, but it's still a steady increase up. So the actual numbers of people had never, in the last 400 years, gone down. So it's always an upward trend. The only thing that stops that is actually not the death rate, which is then perhaps climate change, it's the fertility rate. And it's that balancing, because again, when we had huge mortality of infants, whereby 50% of them would die, women would then have 4 or 5 children, and only 2 of them would make them into adulthood. So we're very good as humans at adapting to make sure we still replace ourselves. The problem is, when we're in that mindset, we've got to have 4 children, we've got to have 4 children, have 5 children, etc., but then they all survive. And that's the shift, where women's education comes up, and then the woman goes, hang on, do you know how expensive these children are? Do you know you have to send them to university, etc.? Yeah, we're only having 2. Well, I want 6. Yeah, guess what? We're only having 2. And you don't have a choice about it. And so that's the transition. So that's the first thing. So no, climate change, however severe it gets, even with all the doomsayers and things like that saying we're all going to burn up, it's not going to happen. Population will still, hopefully, peak and then slowly drift down. You also then said about human condition. So the problem here is actually we're worried about human misery and the problems, particularly in the poorest countries, whereby, yes, there may be people there, but they will be suffering from natural disasters, they'll be suffering from sort of lack of food and things like that. So it's that increase in human misery and the cost that we're worried about climate change. One of the things that shifts the minds of politicians is when you turn around and you say, this is how much it's going to cost you to protect your people from climate change. Okay? It's going to cost about 20% of world GDP to fix climate change in the future. It's only about 1 or 2% now to fix it now. So it's one of those things that it's cheaper to fix it now than it is to go, oh dear, we've completely buggered it, now we actually got to do something about it. And so there's a wonderful economic argument that we use with politicians. And again, some politicians can think longer term than the next election. A few. A few of them. A few do.
Hi. I'm no expert on nuclear power plants, but it's very important. And from what I've learned over the years, is that a good topic? They're very dangerous?
I always get nuclear when I'm talking about climate change. So yes, I've got the killer answer. Yes, that's fine.
Okay, so I was shocked to hear that they actually allow fracking near nuclear power plants. And so anyway, looking towards the future, what can be done to replace nuclear power plants?
Right. So I always try to be diplomatic when it comes to nuclear power. So The interesting thing is that I argue that in democracies, you have to decide whether you wish to take the risk of nuclear power or not. Now, a country that has, France. France gets 90% of its electricity from nuclear power stations. It's been great, except all of their power stations were built in the 50s and 60s are now coming to the end of their life. They're looking at a decommissioning bill that looks like a year's GDP in France. Just a huge number. I mean, it's just ridiculous. So the problem is that nuclear power looks great on paper. Well, it's low carbon. Admittedly, all it is a giant concrete ball, okay? So concrete is a huge carbon signature. So that's the first thing. However, you then have to think about the long-term decommissioning and how much it costs. So if you do a lifetime analysis of nuclear power, I would say that it isn't carbon neutral. It has quite a large carbon signature. And also, it costs a huge amount. The British government at the moment is talking about a new power station. The Chinese want to fund it. Yes, no thank you. Again, compared with putting up wind turbines off of out at sea, or having sort of solar panels. Again, the way we generate electricity, I'm not convinced that we need nuclear power stations. Now, if fusion ever works, and they've been promising me that for the last 50 years, and it'll be promised for the next 50 years, if fusion ever works, then that would be fantastic.
What's that?
So fusion. So at the moment, what we do with nuclear power is we have a uranium, and we allow it to break down. That releases huge amounts of energy. However, fusion, you take hydrogen and hydrogen, just like you do in the actual sun, smash it together and crush it under such incredible pressure, it forms helium and releases huge amounts of energy. And that's what the sun does. The sun is basically a nuclear fusion reactor and just basically smashing hydrogen together, which then creates energy. And so if you can do that, and guess what you get out? Water. Okay? So again, it'd be fantastic. But at the moment, the amount of research, the amount of money being put into it, people have argued that we need the sort of funding that the Apollo program had when you sent men into space and landed on the moon. Which, interestingly enough, you spent in the US, I love this figure, 4% of American GDP on the Apollo space program. Okay? Which, interestingly, in the 60s, was 1% of world GDP, because $1 in $4 was actually generated by the United States of America in the 50s and the 60s. That's how big your economy was compared with the rest of the world. But you spent 4%. Can you imagine spending 4% on something like that now? But you could do it. You've done it with the road networks. I mean, the Highway Act of Eisenhower, you spent equivalent dollars today $580 billion on making sure your country had roads to connect everywhere, okay, and huge highways. So again, you can do that. You can actually decide to spend that sort of large chunks of money with a country this size.
Doesn't it make you nervous to know that they have built nuclear plants next to seismic fault lines and that they're allowing fracking nearby, which can cause
I personally,
issues?
and so this is my own personal opinion, I'm not a fan of nuclear power. I actually think it is can be dangerous. If it is not perfectly controlled, you can have some severe incidents. Now, again, certain countries, like Japan, when they had the tsunami, even though they had the best defenses against tsunami, I mean, don't get me wrong, the Japanese are fantastic. Their protections against natural disasters are fantastic. Even then, their nuclear power station was damaged and had to be shut down and has problems. And there's an exclusion zone. So the problem is, I'm not sure the risk is worth it, considering that actually there's so many cheap alternatives. It's not like that Florida doesn't have enough sunlight to actually then fuel all your energy needs. So again, I think it's the alternatives. It's like, well, it sounds great, and it was great in the 60s because we were in the nuclear age. But yeah, we now know that, do you trust every single person to do their job perfectly every time? I mean, again, that's the problem with something that is potentially very dangerous. So for me, I think the dangers are not acceptable. And certain countries like Germany have said that, I'm sorry, they're not ever going to have nuclear power. France have said yes. Britain, as always, is sitting on the fence. And America has companies that decide that they are going to do it. But no, I wouldn't frack underneath a nuclear power station, personally, you know. Close. Yes, close, but remember, fracking can cause earthquakes of magnitude, say, 3 or 4. Now, that's small, because even coal mines do that. But hey, still going to move the, yeah. I don't want any cracks in that concrete. Sir.
Earlier, Dr. Oppenlander, Dr. Richard Oppenlander, talked about his approach, which, to summarize very shortly, would be that one of the major dangers to climate change is caused by methane, and which is generated by livestock in the main. And also livestock uses directly and indirectly a huge amount of water.
Mm-hmm.
He was saying a meat-eating household uses up about close to 1 million gallons of water per household. So he was saying that this trend is going to, in the not too distant future, lead to some major climate and water problems. And the solution that he presented, as I understand it, was to get the kind of ratio of, bring down that ratio so that much less water and methane is being used and produced. And that method would be basically to switch what we eat. Mm-hmm. He was saying only a small fraction of that would take place if we ate the correct foods, basically eliminating the meat-eating diet. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts about that?
So agriculture and our diet, I think, are incredibly important when we're looking at the future. If we're looking at wanting to live longer and healthier lives, then we have to deal with the obesity crisis that's hitting the whole of the Western world, which is related directly to diet. If we look at climate change, about 80% of all the greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere is from industry, our cars, from our industrial life. 20%, perhaps a little less, perhaps down to about 15%, is from land use changes, so deforestation, agriculture, and things like that. So again, it is still a very important part. So it's not that climate change scientists have forgotten about it, but we then have other issues, which is, yes, we should definitely move to a less meat-rich diet. We have a real problem in China, because the Chinese middle classes look to America, look to Europe, and they go, I want a McDonald's. I want a McDonald's whenever I want, or I want to have meat on my plate every single day. Now, thank you for saying I look young, but I'm not. So when I was a kid, we had meat on Sunday, okay? We had a roast on Sunday because my parents could afford meat once a week. We might get a bit of mince, perhaps, for bolognese, perhaps sometime in the rest of the week, and a little bit of fish, okay? Because we weren't able to afford meat all the time, okay? So again, we've changed that we can have our roast dinners every single day if we want, because we have grown in wealth. But yes, you're absolutely right. I would say that we need to shift. And the big problem, though, is how we get that change. Now, lots of people say we have to make choices and things like that, but I'm convinced that we need, and I know this is probably the wrong audience to say, is we need regulation to actually try to move and shift our choices, okay? We also need to curb the power of advertisement. The problem is that we are all saturated with these advertisements all the time, which are showing you foods which are packed full of sugars, okay? I mean, I think it's later this week, someone will be talking about diet and sugar, and basically they've now called that white sugar is actually more dangerous than heroin for you. Not quite, I don't think that's quite true, okay?
Addictive.
But I think that's maybe an exaggeration.
It's more, in mice, they've found that, that sugar is the most addictive substance compared to opiates of any kind.
Yeah. And the thing is, I know this because after this, I'll be chatting to you next door and I'll be going, I want a chocolate bar. Okay, we all know this. But again, we get deluged. Now, we're lucky because most of you are sort of like my age, and therefore we have that background of a previous generation where we weren't constantly needing that. I feel bad for my children because, I mean, they're doing well, but actually, they're constantly bombarded by this, you should eat this, you should eat this, you should eat this. And how do you battle against that? So I'm with you. Yes, we should definitely go to a much more vegetarian diet. I think that meat will still be important because I think that we do need to ensure that people get protein. It's actually not as easy. I mean, I've got very good friends who are vegan and vegetarian. It isn't that easy to get. And of course, at some point, we'll have to produce artificial meat. Why are we slaughtering thousands of animals when perhaps we can make artificial meat? But that's because I'm looking at much further into the future. But no, your point is fantastic.
I think there's a presentation coming up you may want to watch with Garth Davis. He wrote a book called Proteinaholic.
Right.
And he'll present some cases of where plant protein is definitely a
You mean now I
choice.
strayed out of my area of expertise?
Yes. Now, to go back, I mean, even Michael Pollan has suggested that in an environmental sense, we would have to reduce our meat consumption to about 2 ounces a week. And it would be about a quarter of a glass of milk, a very small piece of steak. And going back to Dr. Oppenlander, he suggested that the numbers of greenhouse gas emissions from livestock is closer to 30 or even 50%. He falls somewhere in around the middle, whereas you're suggesting it's maybe less than 15. So
is he talking about just methane? Or is he talking about all greenhouse gases?
So basically taking into consideration everything that would go into the carbon footprint of creating animal foods.
Right.
So going from cradle to grave of a product, how much energy is needed to get that from the ground to someone's plate. And that, when you take everything into consideration, rises up to around 50% of greenhouse gas emissions in some people's estimations, and others around 30, and then very conservatively 18 to 15 is what I've heard. So,
question there. Oh, was that a question?
well, yeah, I'm just wondering, but you are saying that you think it's 15 or less, so.
No, so I personally haven't studied this. I do study quite a lot of things. So the International Panel on Climate Change has 3 major reports. So there's the science one, there's the social science one, and there's the economics one. They also are mandated to record countries' emissions. And so there's a huge international effort to basically check what people are doing, to actually check how much emissions, and they do this through understanding power stations, understanding agriculture. So there is a huge body of work there that actually tries to study all the actual sources of greenhouse gases. Now, what may help us in the future to disentangle is that NASA have put up a satellite that actually looks at CO2 and methane sources on the planet. So you can actually use the satellite pictures, process them, and go, oh, look, there's the point source of the CO2 coming out. So that might be able to help to untangle it. But again, I would argue that we forget how much. I mean, just think of the energy consumption of this building with the air conditioning, the lights, etc. That is huge compared with, say, the steak that I'm going to eat at lunch.
Yes, but I mean, if there's a building that houses the animals as well. So if in America we have a certain billion amount of people, and then there's a certain also billions of animals, they also require housing. So
Yep.
this is where I think there's a disconnect, because are we accounting for that housing, or is that housing being put into human consumption?
I would have to look it up.
Yeah.
As in, I don't know because it's not quite my field. I just want to change the world. So, that's my field, yeah. Sir?
This Anthropocene
Yes.
era, a period that you've identified, how widely accepted is this concept? It's the first time I've ever encountered it, and is the acceptance of this growing in the world?
So it was first suggested in the Western science field in year 2000. And it was used as a term to try and sum up. And since then, it's grown in popularity, and through the science community, it's been picked up. Because one of the things I'm very aware of as a climate scientist is that for the last 35 years, all we've done is told you to worry about climate change. Now, that's important, but it has masked and actually not shown all the other problems that we're causing. And I think that's a real disservice because in Europe and the US in the 1970s, the grassroots environmental movement was absolutely fantastic. We're seeing all the local problems that are happening. And that has been lost with this grand narrative that it's all climate change, which it isn't. The biodiversity is an absolute nightmare. The extinction rates are huge. And so all of that. And so suddenly all the scientists have gone, oh, we've got a term that sums up all the bad stuff we're doing, and we don't have to just talk about climate change. So in the science community, it's gone through like a wildfire. Okay? Now, of course, scientists love to argue, so this is part of the when did it start, and I need to have a golden spike and show when it starts. Irrelevant. It's the debate. It's also, I'm now talking to philosophers. I'm working with historians. I'm working with sort of ecologists, because it's spread through academia. You've got the social scientists going, we love this term, but it should be the Capitalocene, or it should be the Techneocene, and it's generating these conversations. So I don't care whether the geologists eventually define it formally. It's these discussions I think are really, really important. I think that's the most important thing. So I think it's for some reason the UK press and the New York Times and things like that love it. Whenever the Anthropocene comes up in a paper, etc., they suddenly produce a new paper about it. So it's going to start, I think it's going to start spreading. And I think in, say, the next decade, you will probably be talking about the Anthropocene and the importance of humans as a geological force just as much as worrying about climate change. That's my hope, okay? Because again, as a climate change scientist, I'm really aware that climate change has dominated global politics and things like that, but it's only one of the problems that we face. And I think that, without meaning to, because there are so many skeptics, we've just become so focused on that, and which is, again, I'm partly at fault to doing that, because I've spent all my time going, I'm going to try and stay calm, I'm not going to hit you, but guess what? Climate change is real, and it's a problem. And again, we forget about all the other things. So I'm hoping it does take off. Sorry, Steve, all yours. That's right.